Hi, I am Miguel Paredes, and as a big fan of Arcane, I've been feeling the obligation of sculpting something from that series, and I thought what better way to start a little Arcane figure collection than with Jinx. First of all, I made a two-part armature. I glued both parts with the extremely reliable and resistant epoxy. If you don't know what this epoxy thing is, it is basically a clay that comes out in two parts. These two parts are mixed and a chemical reaction takes place, and in about 3 or 4 hours, maybe more, it depends on the brand, the clay sets itself and hardens. I also put a little wire for the neck, and once the epoxy had cured, I started to give it the pose that I wanted, which in this case would be this one, with the minigun. I was very tempted to do this other one because it looks a lot easier, but I like this one better. Later on I would be questioning that decision, but I think it was worth it in the end. Then I grabbed a block of Super Sculpey and inserted the armature on it, and to give it volume and stability I used aluminum foil and epoxy. And I also made a bunch of small cuts on the epoxy so that the polymer clay would have something to grab on. And speaking of polymer clay, it is time to bulk up the body. At this point, my plan was to sculpt all the details of her costume, bake her, then paint her, and that was it. In fact, I managed to sculpt most of her boots and pants, but in this initial part it happened quite frequently that while I was working on the details of one section, I damaged by accident another that was already done. I didn't want to start making all the details of her costume and have to work with that constant fear of not damaging anything, so I decided that after sculpting a good portion of her boots and pants, I was going to bake her, and the rest of the costume was going to be sculpted later. But before that, I had to make her head. Once I was done sculpting her face, I put her head in place, but then I realized that at some point I would have to paint her face, so I cut her head off. And then it was time to bake her.
45 minutes later.
With the body completely hardened, I started to work on the details of her costume, and holy shit, this ended up being a more time-consuming figure than I had anticipated. She has like 5 different belts, buckles, and weird things. As you may have already noticed, I'm not using polymer clay, but instead I'm using epoxy clay. I didn't want to bake her a second time, and epoxy, it's a pretty decent material when it comes to sculpting details like this. Of course, I had to keep in mind that with epoxy my time was limited, so I had to be pretty precise and fast. I had to be confident of what I was sculpting. As Lord Shin used to say, hesitation is defeat. Fortunately for me, the individual parts didn't have that much detail, well, except for that spiky thing on her waist and the laces on her boots, but besides that there wasn't that much of a problem. As for the paint, I started by applying a white coat as a base tone before applying a few coats of skin tone. Probably the most tedious part of the whole process was painting her cloud tattoos. They are pretty simple, but every cloud has an outline, and I'm not good when it comes to painting perfect thin lines, especially if they are curved. So I took a long time trying to get the cleanest lines possible. And speaking of difficult things to paint, the pants had some vertical thin stripes which were outlined as well. So yeah, these first steps of the painting weren't that much fun, but besides that, everything else was pretty straightforward. With the figure mostly painted, it was time to make some additional details, starting with this belt. As I said, I wasn't planning on baking her a second time, so I used air dry clay mixed with brown paint, which ended up being a perfect material for this because of its bendiness when it dries. Polymer clay is pretty good and all, but when it comes to thin and delicate things like this, it might not be the best option. After that, I just needed to paint some additional details here and there, and add these things on her boots, and now we can move on to the minigun. Looking at some photos, I was able to notice that the minigun is made up of 8 main pieces, not including barrels, so making these 8 pieces was the next step. And after a quick bake, they were ready to get sanded. And before putting all the pieces together, I needed to add some details with epoxy. A wire, epoxy, and a little bit of super glue were more than enough to hold each piece in place. And then I just needed to add some final details to the main body of the minigun. I made the barrels with air dry clay with a front part made out of epoxy, and in order to attach them to the rest of the minigun, as well as to give them some stability, I inserted a wire on the back and glued them to this flat piece. Then I made 3 smaller barrels and placed them on the back, and once I was done with that, I was able to assemble the barrels with the rest of the minigun. To finish with the sculpting part of the minigun, I only needed to put some details with epoxy like that one there, as well as to make the trigger and the handle, which being such thin and delicate parts, I decided that air dry clay was my best option. And with the minigun fully assembled, it was time to paint it. With the minigun now painted, I made the hands with epoxy, and before they cured, I decided that it was time to attach the minigun to the figure. So, with the help of a tiny wire, super glue, and the still not hard epoxy from the hands, I did just that. Of course, that was easier said than done because I had to make sure that both hands matched the arms. I think that one hand ended up being a little longer than the other, but nobody cares, so yeah, fuck it. And once the epoxy from the hands was completely hard, I made a few additional details and painted them. And as a last detail of the minigun, I made this strap. After that, it was time to make this gun. It wasn't that difficult to sculpt, so I won't take too long explaining this part, and that's it. For the base, I wanted something cool and simple, like something that wasn't too hard to make, but at the same time something that looked that some effort was put into it. So an oval shaped base with some lines on top seemed good enough for me. Of course, I wasn't going to leave it just grey, cause grey is not cool. So after I made a couple of holes for the feet, followed by a quick bake and a quick sanding, it was time to paint it. At the end, I realized that it looked kinda dull, so I painted one of those monkey doodles on top of the base, and on the sides, well, I just painted a bunch of Jinx style scribbles. And you know what? I'm happy with how the base turned out. It looks cool and simple. Okay, and the last thing that is missing is her head, which was missing her hair and eyebrows, so I started by working on those details. And now we move on to the braids. As I said, air dry clay has some elasticity when it dries, so it is the perfect option to make very thin and long pieces. So for each braid I made 3 long and skinny worms, almost as long as the figure itself, because that's how fucking long these braids are. And then, well, I made the braids. I admit that before this I had no idea how to make braids. So I had to look on YouTube for tutorials, and I found a video of this lady braiding a girl. I don't remember the name of the channel or the video, but still, thank you very much, random lady who knows how to make braids. Thanks to you, now I know how to make them, so yeah. That's pretty great. Then I cut them into different pieces because they are divided by these things, and to give them some stability I put a wire through the center, which was harder than it looks because I let them dry out too much. So when I tried to put the wire through them I ran into considerable resistance from the clay. And before attaching them to the head I made these things with epoxy and the ends of the braids with air dry clay. And with that finished, the head was ready for painting. At the end I glued the head in place, gave some movement to the braids, and put a coat of paint sealer over the entire figure, and we are finished! Okay, and that's it! I really hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe and all that YouTube stuff. Yeah, thanks for watching. Yeah, I'm gonna leave you with some final photos. Okay, bye!